A stable, growing economy. Nice to have, isn't it? Have you ever wondered if there's actually anybody trying to make that happen? Well, turns out that would be the job of the Federal Reserve. But where did the Federal Reserve come from? What does it do? And, is it working? Let's break it down. (1791). The brand new U.S. Congress agrees to the plan put forward by Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton to establish the first bank of the United States. Its authority was rather modest compared to central banks of today, but this act still proved controversial, due to the recently written Constitution not explicitly granting Congress the authority to create such a bank. The bank's charter included a sunset clause, meaning the bank would only continue to exist if it was renewed, which it wasn't. In 1811, at the end of its 20-year charter, Congress opted to let the controversial bank dissolve. Alexander Hamilton provided no comment, because he was dead. But Congress tried again, establishing the second Bank of the United States in 1816. Another sunset clause, and 20 years later, it also doesn't get renewed. And that settled the question of a central bank in the US. At least for a while. Fast forward to the early 1900s, the Progressive Era, and President Woodrow Wilson decides to try again. But this time, things are different. This new central bank, called the Federal Reserve, also holds the duties of setting the nation's monetary policy and keeping the value of the dollar stable. The structure of the Federal Reserve, also known as the Fed, is neither fully government-controlled nor fully private. As the Fed describes itself, it is, quote, independent within the government. The president nominates the Fed chairman and board of governors, but the president then has no power to remove them. These appointees have typically been people with banking and economic backgrounds, rather than political figures. This follows a common trend from the Progressive Era. History has made it clear that politicians often don't have a clue what they're doing when it comes to economic policy. So instead, we should follow the establishment experts. They're not just know-nothing politicians, so they must be right.
We need the public to believe the experts.
Just like the last two times, the new central bank also had a 20-year sunset clause. But 14 years later, in 1927, Congress dipped back in and removed the sunset. Now the Federal Reserve could only be dissolved by an active intent of Congress, which pretty much meant the Fed was here to stay, dutifully keeping our economy stable. 2 years later, we entered the Great Depression.
Good job.
So what exactly does the Fed do? Well, let's look at their mission statement. It says, the mission of the Federal Reserve System is to foster the stability, integrity, and efficiency of the nation's monetary, financial, and payment systems so as to promote optimal macroeconomic performance. Okay, cool. How do they do that? There are three main avenues. First, the Fed sets interest rates, which helps determine how easy it is for people or institutions to access loans and credit. Second, the Fed sets requirements for how much cash banks are required to keep on hand. And third, the Fed takes part in what's called open market operations, which means the buying and selling of government bonds to commercial banks. Yeah, that one gets pretty wonky. So now that we've had the Fed for over 100 years, is it working? As a metric, let's refer back to their own mission statement. Are they keeping our money stable? Well, let's take a look at the historical value of the US dollar. In 2022, it takes $32.85 to match the value of a single dollar in 1789. Here's the Fed's founding in 1913. And here is where we left the gold standard, giving the Fed much more flexibility to manipulate the dollar. Over $29 of the increase, or 89%, has been since the Fed has been given the job of keeping our money stable. Thanks, guys. Let's be blunt. The Fed is objectively failing in its mission. So, what should be done? That's probably too involved for us to get into right now. But the starting point has to be transparency. Because right now, there isn't any. The Fed operates in the dark, sort of like a fourth branch of government, but with minimal checks and balances. While on paper they are accountable to Congress, in practice, they are not. And if they aren't accountable to your representatives, then they aren't accountable to you. But calls have been growing to audit the Fed, for Congress to actually take a hard look at what they are doing behind closed doors, and what assets they are moving around.
Show me the money!
This stance actually has bipartisan support.
We need transparency at the Fed.
I rise in support of auditing the Federal Reserve.
What do you think? Should being independent within the government, whatever that's really supposed to mean, give them a blank check? Or maybe the Fed's lack of accountability is due for a nice sunset.